Frank, you're up.
This is a fabulous presentation. Thank you both. My family has a rich history in African wildlife. We worked with Richard Leakey in Kenya for about 10 years in the very early 90s. I'd like you mentioned and I'm going to be concise. You mentioned that you start with people. I'd like for you to, if you wouldn't mind, elaborate on the interesting conflict between what I would call traditional harvesting. You could call it bushmeat, subsistence, and also the funding that funnels into African wildlife conservation from trophy hunting, which is under such scrutiny right now. And I would love for you to just give a quick summary on that conflict that exists in society in Africa.
I mean, if I can, I think there's really two questions. There's the bushmeat trade that we refer to, which is largely sort of rural and impoverished communities going into protected areas and killing wildlife for sustenance and trophy hunting. I'll start with the trophy hunting side, and I'll remove my personal opinions of hunting from this, because I think that the diplomacy of your question and respecting your involvement with Africa, I think we need to look at numbers, and I think we need to understand where the value is overstated, and get down to debating the real issues at hand. And I think if we look at it, and I noticed in the comments you were talking about being an enormous funder of wildlife conservation, and I think that that's true. But the bulk of that, as I understand it in the States, I'm talking in the context of the US, was that the Pittman-Robertson Act, which came into being in the early 1900s, was established to curb the extent to which animals were being hunted without regulation. And so there was, I think it's an 11% sales tax on arms and ammunition. And that was set up under the premise of sports hunting. And what happened between the early 1900s to where we are today is that of the total firearms and ammunition sold in the US, only 5% is now attributed to hunters. The rest of them are personal private capacity, and one could make a very controversial statement that school shootings, the ammunition used there, have part contributed to the same tax. So I think when we look at it in that sense, we've got to be careful of isolating an ancillary industry, a supplier industry to the hunting industry, and taking that as a total contribution or a mindset contribution to conservation, which I don't think it is. And if we are to believe some of the lawmakers that we've chatted to in DC, is that we know that Pittman-Robertson is being discussed in terms of saying, well, how is this best serving communities? And I know the likes of the NRA and so on are very much involved in those discussions. So from a US perspective, the funds generated for conservation are kept within the US. Pittman-Robertson doesn't support Africa. What supports Africa is the tourism component of what you talk about. I won't use my research numbers. I'll use those of the Professional Hunting Association of South Africa. And if we look at the inbound trophy hunting value to Southern Africa, in a GDP contribution, tourism, which includes trophy hunting, accounts for about 8.9% adjusted of South Africa's GDP. Of that, less than 1% is trophy hunting. If we dig into that further and we say what value of trophy hunting actually goes to communities and or conservation practices outside of the balance sheet of the owner of the land, it's 3%. So you've got a minuscule contribution to any employability within those rural areas. So that's a radically understated contribution. And the reason why I emphasize where those numbers come from is that I think it's a disservice to talk about those contributions purely at a macro level. I know, as much as I'm not a trophy hunter and I never will be, I think that there are organizations, the Cabela family, for example, the big bass fishing family out of the US, are enormous contributors to conservation in Southern Africa. and they are for trophy hunting. They own hunting lands and they're investing in hunting lands, but they do extraordinary conservation work. The only reason why I reference them is that it's not the function of trophy hunting has done that. It's the philanthropy of a family office that has done that, off the profiteering of another industry. So a lot of the time we end up with these examples of trophy hunting contributing so dramatically to conservation. And I think that those numbers are radically overstated. The other consideration is that trophy hunting relies on the wildlife ranching industry in Southern Africa. In South Africa, for example, we're on a Dutch Roman land law system. So if you own the land, you own everything on it, above it, and in it. So when you own a hunting facility, you can purchase an animal, bring it into that ecosystem, release it, and hunt it. So what we're seeing in that is that there's a burgeoning wildlife ranching industry, which is incredibly powerful as a lobbying entity in the country. But what we're seeing is that because we are dropping in wildlife into traditional trophy hunting areas, you're not seeing a maturity in the biodiversity of the lands that are protected under trophy hunting. So yes, there is an extraordinary amount of land that's protected by hunting, but that shouldn't be the single statement. What we should be saying is, how are those areas contributing to the broader biodiversity economy? How are they contributing towards skills development and employability of rural communities that typify the neighbors of these hunting or indeed any conservation area? And ultimately, what are we doing to push what the government here in South Africa has now introduced, called a one welfare policy, that says if we are going to continue to invest in any consumptive practice of wildlife, there must be a provable and scalable association to the socioeconomic challenges that we've spoken about today. And at the moment, there's a standoff between those. So in pockets, yes, there are trophy hunters that contribute to conservation, but the standing statement of trophy hunting contributes to conservation as a holistic industry is radically overstated.
In the bushmeat trade?
The bushmeat trade. So the bushmeat trade is a breeding ground for poachers, because what you've got is young, predominantly men and older men within a village will go into these protected areas. They'll set traps. They'll set the most rudimentary snares to catch various wildlife. They're totally indiscriminate. They'll take what they can get. And so what we're seeing is that there is an impact on the ecological balances within those areas that have been hard hit by the bushmeat trade. And for a long time, that was purely to feed your family. But I'll give you an example. Next to Kruger National Park, which is the largest park in South Africa, and is ground zero of rhino poaching, there is a town that, when I first started going to the bush, and it's this little village called Bushbuck Ridge, and there were maybe about 30, 40,000 people that lived in this village outside Kruger National Park. That area has now grown to house almost 3 million people. It's 2.9 million people. It's done that in the space of a generation. So all of a sudden, you've got these deeply marginalized, impoverished communities that historically were going in and taking out an impala or taking out a warthog or whatever they could find to feed their families. But now it's turned into business. And the skill of going into the bush and tracking and trapping and hunting wildlife suddenly becomes a very enviable skill to a poaching syndicate. So now all of a sudden it's saying, oh, when you're in there and you're taking out the warthog, why don't you take out a rhino and I'll give you more money than your entire family has made in the last 20 years. And your kids can go to school. You can put shoes on their feet and your family isn't going to go hungry for a year. It's an extremely difficult proposition to say no. And if you don't, your neighbor will say yes. So this is, it's fed into a system. And again, to Shannon's point, it's why the socioeconomic challenges of the poaching industry, whether it be bushmeat or syndicate, are at the root of this. Anti-poaching guys with big guns shooting poachers, is a band-aid, because there's another guy and another guy and another guy that's prepared to lose his life to feed his family.
That is an excellent answer. Thank you.